Welcome to Voodoo Whiskey Gaming, and this is my late review of Remnant from the Ashes. I played it on the PS4, then on the PS5 via backwards compatibility, because yes, I finally got one. It's also available on the PC and the Xbox One and the Xbox Series. So the game starts out, you create your character, and you basically almost immediately set out on an adventure to save the world. You need to travel to an island, you reach said island, and then a storm comes in and fucks shit up and makes everything far more difficult for you than it could have been. I mean, it's a video game. What did you expect? Where would the story be otherwise? You are rescued by a group of people living in a place called Ward 13. They basically bring you back from the brink of death, and you once again set out on an adventure. And I'll say this, for a Soulsborne style game, the story is a little more in your face, but it's still pretty sparse. This is very much a game that is meant to be driven by the gameplay, not unlike the Soulsborne style games. Now let's get into the audio, and the voiceover work it's there. Okay, the way I said that makes it sound like it's really terrible, which it's not, but it is also not good. As for the music is fine. I actually think the music's pretty good in this game. I don't have any complaints. I will say at the same time, though, I didn't feel like it was particularly memorable. And then there's the sound effects, and I think the sound effects work. I think they work well with the guns and the creatures and the world itself. I think they did a good job there. I like the gun sound effects because these aren't necessarily, modern guns. They're not the most realistic guns, and they're not meant to be. They're supposed to sound a little more handmade, and I think they did a good job with that. Now, as for the gameplay mechanics and whatnot, as I said already, this is very much a Soulsborne style game, but it's a third-person shooter Soulsborne style game. But I won't say that that necessarily works in this game's favor, because there are certain things that you expect from that kind of game, and this game doesn't really deliver on a lot of those. I will say the first time I ran into a boss, it kicked my ass several times, but then I literally unlocked one ability and I burnt through the boss in one try. And I'm going to say this, the bosses are honestly very disappointing in this game, or at least all the ones that I have fought, because of the fact that they are basically not hard. At their core, these bosses are not difficult to beat. The developers, in what I consider a lazy-ass move to basically falsely enhance the difficulty of the boss fights, they just also swarm you with hordes of smaller, lesser enemies. It just, at the end of the day, feels really fucking lazy. I will say though, I think there are some neat elements. I like that you have your long gun, a short gun, and a melee weapon, and I do think it does kind of suck that you are stuck with those, and quite frankly, a lot of the long guns I found were pretty useless. I wound up using the character with the coach gun, and I basically stuck with it after that, because quite frankly, the hunting rifle wasn't that beneficial because I wasn't at a long enough range most of the time for it to be a beneficial weapon to me. There were a lot of areas where that just didn't feel useful. So I'm going to put that out there. I do like the upgrading system for the weapons, although, this being a game with guns, I would like a lot more variety in the weapons, and there really isn't a huge variety of weapons. I found that pretty disappointing. As for the world itself, I think they did a good job mapping it out with the exploration, but I will say they could have linked the zones together better. They're not huge areas, they're not huge, overly complicated enemies, so the fact that there are these massive loading screens in between each of these zones, and massive is a bit of a stretch, but it's far longer than you would expect considering the size of the areas you're going between. And I will say, playing on the PS5 did make that better, but it was still a decent load time considering, again, the size of the areas. As for how the game actually plays, you've got a lot of dodging, a lot of shooting, and quite frankly, there's not a lot of uniqueness between the enemies from a combat standpoint. I really didn't feel like each new enemy I was seeing was fighting in a new and unique way. So let's get into the controls, and I gotta say, I actually think the controls work very well. I was impressed with them. I don't have any major complaints. I'm trying to think of any right now that are coming to me, and they're just not coming to me. And since they're not coming to me, I guess that means I don't really have any complaints with the controls. I gotta say, I was actually pretty happy with them. Let's get into the visuals, and I gotta say, disappointing. Just flat out disappointing. All of this looks pretty last gen, and I'm not talking Xbox One, I'm talking 360, PS3 generation. It's not an impressive looking game. There's a pretty severe lack of detail in a lot of the things, just in the world in general, in your character. I could have been far more impressed with that. There are some things visually, though, that I will say are impressive. From more of an artistic standpoint, not necessarily like those hardcore realistic graphics. And the first off is, the first area you get to is very much this post-apocalyptic city we've seen 1.5 million times now. And it felt really basic and generic, and I was like, oh, okay, you know, we've seen this before, blah blah blah. But you start getting into other areas and it starts to become more unique. You start to see some pretty cool areas as the story progresses. So I was actually pleased with that change. On top of that, I really like the creature design. Some of these creatures are things that I hadn't really seen before in other games, and I was like, okay, I'm down with that. I thought that was pretty cool. But then I got to a couple of boss fights, and they felt lazy as hell. I mean, there are some where they're pretty cool with different, unique designs, but several of the bosses I ran into are basically just larger versions of generic enemies that I had already run into, and that's disappointing to me. That's lazy again. Which is disappointing when you run into, like, the Ent boss who looks like a giant tree Cthulhu, and I thought that was a cool and unique look. But then you run into other bosses where you're like, oh, I've fought this guy about 1 million times, now he's just larger. So overall, I gotta say, I'm not overly impressed with the visuals, but it does have some good elements. Which leads me into my wrap-up of the game, and honestly, it's okay. Like, that's the best I can say about this game, and that's unfortunate because a third-person shooter, Soulsborne style game sounds really cool. Unfortunately, it just wasn't well executed. I mean, admittedly, I've got to say, I think that would be more difficult to execute than a melee-based Soulsborne style game, like the vast majority of them are. But, I mean, I'm not a developer. That's up to them to figure that out and make it worth the time and money. And unfortunately, I gotta say, Remnant really isn't worth the time or money because there are better Souls-like games out there. So unfortunately, I'm gonna say skip unless you are hardcore desperate for a Souls-like game, which I will preface this by saying it's easier than, you know, the Souls games. Okay, so in the comments down below, why don't you tell me, would you want a really good Souls-like game that's a third-person shooter? Because I do. As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. And if you like what I'm doing in general, share and subscribe. Have a good one.